Hello. As we start chapter 8, I want to kind of start with a discussion about the unique challenges of police work, the very real danger with like corruption and how we make try to put checks and balances in place to make accountability more likely when is misbehavior and things of that nature. So one of my objectives in starting early on with where we look at different videos over the course of the semester and talk about what what sticks out or what what perspectives we can get from it is that I want to show different kind of areas of where that pose a unique challenge to law enforcement officers. So, like I talked about last week, there's this job is multifaceted, um, and so there's a lot of skill sets that are beneficial, in different situations, um, and maybe not so beneficial in other situations. So you know one of the major emphasis that we've had in the last like 10 to 15 years really has been de-escalation, which is a necessary skill for a police officer. It absolutely is, but it is not a substitute for taking care of business when business needs to be taken care of. When you come into a tense, rapidly evolving situation that is very dangerous and very uh, tenuous, I guess would be a good word for it. Um, Swift, decisive action is what's going to save the day, in those situations. But there are a lot of encounters and that where law enforcement officers just could use more patience and actually um, make it less likely to have to resort to higher levels of force and that kind of stuff. So, um, but there's a lot of different nuances to what we do. And it is so much is dependent on the circumstances, really, that it makes it hard to talk about it in the general sense because we go call to call to call to call. Patrol officers are often very busy, and those calls run the emotional gambit between the so-called routine traffic stop to uh, a medical call where there's somebody uh, that you know gets into a car wreck, or there's um, something, a disturbance, at a business where there's a disgruntled customer that refuses to leave, and we've got to go trespass them and move them on, and then we might go, to a shots fired call, and then arrive on scene to find out that there wasn't shots fired. It was, a car backfiring or fireworks or something along those lines. And so you get your kind of adrenaline going, for something that turns out to be nothing, you know. And then other times you get dispatched to something that seems like a very dull kind of a call, and all hell breaks loose, when you get there. Um, and so we have this kind of emotional roller coaster of ups and downs, and then we might go to a fatality accident, and have to um, you know hold somebody's hand when they take their dying breath, and then maybe we go to a suicide call, or something like that. Like, and I'm not trying to make it out like all of this stuff happens in every shift, but it is that those up and ups and downs are definitely um, something that most people don't think about whenever they look at an officer and how they act in a particular situation, you know, and none of that other stuff, is necessarily known. What they dealt with on their other calls that day, or what they've uh, dealing with at home. The job is difficult from a perspective of like being a family, person. So if you know, we work, well, some agencies still work eights. Most agencies, I think, have moved on to 12s. Um, but those shifts, sometimes they do shift rotations where you're not even working the same hours all the time. You're switching, every 3 months, every 6 months, or however long you're going from days to nights. You know, um, Staffing and manpower issues sometimes can kind of force mandatory overtime, or particular critical incidents or issues can put them into, you know uh, where you're working more hours. Call outs, sometimes you get called out in the middle of the night, sometimes you get called out with very little notice. you know Sometimes you're supposed to get off at a particular time, but then you end up getting into a major thing, and you've got to have that you know keeps you over, either a critical incident, or maybe just a like a DWI at the end of your shift or something like that, where you've got to go deal with that. And it can, I mean, it's stressful, but it also is difficult if you've got, a spouse and children and things like that counting on you. It can create problems that way. So within law enforcement, there's increased problems with um, substance abuse or depression, anxiety, um, all of the kind of mental health things that go along with stress, high stress jobs. And it's not unique to police officers. Like a lot of jobs that carry high stress levels are going to have similar problems because it's it's difficult to deal with. You just have to, find what works for you in terms of um, not carrying that around with you, but finding outlets that help you to calm down at the end of your shift, and uh, avoid um, unhealthy coping mechanisms, I guess is the best way to put it. Um, but and I'm not saying any of that to make excuses for cops making bad decisions or doing bad things. I'm just saying that when we have a situation where maybe we're a little less patient than we should be on a particular call, it very likely could just be that, that officer is just kind of having a little bit of burnout that day. And, you know, rather than it being a character issue with them. Um, so we have that side of the issue. And then we also have the very real possibility, because police officers have a lot of discretion about how they spend their time and what decisions that they make on particular calls. There is, and historically has been, a very real possibility that officers can descend into outright corruption, where they're either taking bribes or they're practicing favoritism towards or against certain people for selfish reasons, for um, based on protected class, issues, um, those kinds of things. And it is something that the public is rightfully concerned about. It is something that you from time to time do hear about, issues being uncovered where officers are fired, arrested, charged, convicted, for serious crimes, that it's it's worth talking about, because it can run the gambit from just looking the other way, to cover for people that you're friendly with, you know, to actually taking bribes, actively committing crimes themselves, um, going after the competition. So, you get in and develop a friendship with one set of criminal organization, and then they basically task you to go after the other. Um, and then it can also get up to a point where you're actually threatening people, assaulting people, all that kind of stuff. So, um, so how do we try to prevent the stress of the job from eating people alive, and then also how do we put barriers in place that make corruption less attractive, less likely, and more likely to be uncovered if it does occur? And so probably one of the oldest approaches to that was what we call internal affairs investigations, which means that the agency, particularly larger agencies, they will have a whole division that is dedicated to professional standards. And they obviously, if the need arises to where officers commit crimes and need to be charged and arrested, then of course, then it can rise to that level. But it can also, short of that, also be part of the disciplinary process to say, hey, you messed up. This needs to be corrected. Um, so it can be that they're getting, disciplinary notices, they're getting suspensions, they're getting fired, they're getting something short of a criminal sanction, but still addressing, you know, the issue from an employment standard. So internal affairs investigations slash professional standards, those types of things have been around almost from the beginning of law enforcement, and it's trying to discourage that. So something else that's a little bit more of a recent phenomenon is accreditation, meaning that there's a national group, the uh, International Association of Chiefs of Police, that has created an accreditation standard. They call it CALIA. It's not as widespread now as it probably will be soon, but when I worked for the Missouri Capitol Police, we were CALIA certified. The Highway Patrol is. A lot of major metropolitan police departments are. It still hasn't trickled down much into the more rural areas, mainly because it is a time consuming and tedious process and also quite expensive from what I understand. And so it's just hard to get the funds to get on board with it to begin with. But really, what this accreditation standard is primarily about is bringing agency policies in line with kind of a national standard. And that standard is based on addressing the concerns of citizens in a lot of different areas. but a lot of it has to do with that professionalism and ethics, and creating policies that make accountability easier, right? That you can't do an off the books investigation. You can't uh, that you can't use discretion in ways that disproportionately impact minority communities or anything like that. Um, there's like nowadays with body cams. I mean, body cams prior to probably 10 or 15 years ago, probably more like 15 years ago at this point. Um, the only the only cameras we really had were the car cameras, like on traffic stops, and that goes back to probably about the 90s, you know, late 80s, early 90s. Um, that they had cameras in the cars, but like as far as out on a scene, cameras can only see where they're pointed, right? So if the camera's in your car and you get out of your car to go deal with somebody, unless you're standing right in front of your car, that camera's not going to pick it up. Well, with the body worn cameras now, it is going with us wherever we go. And so it is recording more things than ever before. But there is a caveat with that, just like there was with the cameras on limitations of the cameras in the car, and that is that it can still only see where it's pointed. And so, with it being mounted generally on the front of our vest, it it's only going to see where our basically where our body armor is pointed. And so, if if I am facing one direction and I hear something and turn my head, but not my whole body, then the camera is not going to pick up what I'm seeing. Likewise, if I'm in the car, if I'm in the patrol car, that camera is really just going to be pointed right at my steering wheel. And so if I'm looking out the windshield and I can see something, my camera is not going to see it. My body camera. Now, if I have a car camera, then yeah, but like, and even then, the car camera is going to be facing forward. So if it's to the side, so that is the downside of cameras, is that it it's only going to see. It's not necessarily going to see everything we see. It's only going to see from its own perspective what it can see. But it's been a good thing over the last 15 years that we've had pervasive use of body cameras. Well, 10 years really pervasive. Um, it's it has revolutionized accountability, because what we relied on before cameras were recording most police interactions, we had to rely on witnesses, so you have the officer is a witness and you have maybe the suspect is a witness, or they're going to tell a version of the story. The officer is going to tell a version of the story. And then maybe you have another witness or two that might fill in the things. And then the court, basically, when you go to trial, the court has to try to figure out, okay, you've got the officer saying this, the bad guy saying this, and then the witness that's, saying this. And what do we think the truth is? You know, and but now a lot of times we have the officer, we have the suspect, and we have that other witness, but then we also have the video. And so where we used to rely on the officer says, well, he said, quote, whatever, and the suspect says, no, I didn't say that. I said this, and it's something kind of similar, but not exactly the same. And that those um, kind of semantic type arguments would happen a lot in court. Well, now a lot of times you can just say, "Oh, let's play the video." Okay, he definitely said what he said, and it can kind of take some ambiguity out of situations because people will sometimes remember things a certain way, but it's not necessarily true. And it doesn't mean they're lying. It doesn't mean they're intentionally deceiving, but memory isn't a recording, you know? But when we have a recording, then it can help figure out the specific words that were actually said, which can be, in some cases, what the whole case turns on that. So, nevertheless, you've got um, that aspect of it. And then a lot of, especially like 10 years ago when the big push came and almost every agency virtually overnight was getting body cameras and outfitting them, and we had policies that said that they had to be on anytime that we were interacting with people that were, in an enforcement capacity. um, it also allowed us sometimes, where we used to not where we used to had to sometimes give the benefit of the doubt, in situations because we only had two versions of the story and we didn't really know which one was true. But now, well, it also allows when somebody comes in and complains and says, "Hey, this officer was rude to me," right? Well, what do you mean he was rude to you? And then they tell you, and they say, "Well, he called me the B word or whatever," and so they can actually look at that body cam footage, for that encounter, even if that's not something that ends up where somebody got arrested or whatever. Maybe it's just, you know, uh, a call where they ended up addressing the issue and not having to arrest anybody, but that person still comes in and complains saying that the officer called them a derogatory name. Well, it doesn't have to be his word against hers anymore or whatever, or the officer's word against the bad guys. You can look at the body cam, and the body cam, you play the body cam back, and nowhere on that body cam is that offensive word used. Well, either you're mistaken or you're a liar. But either way, the officer didn't do anything wrong. Or you play it back, and sure enough, yep, he called her the B word, you know, and so now you have a sit down with that officer, or it gets, if it's not the first time there's been a problem with them, maybe they end up getting suspended, maybe they end up getting fired, like it's just, it can be addressed. Things can be addressed that didn't used to necessarily be able to be addressed because unless there was an eyewitness or some independent type of thing, it was difficult to prove. Now you can prove it. So when body cameras first became prevalent, that was the big, from the community perspective, they thought, oh, well, all of these officers are going to, start getting in trouble for stuff. But by and large, my experience anyway with that has been that it's, at least 80% of the time, if not higher, um, that the review of the body camera shows that the officer did an acceptable job, and that the person complaining is either mistaken or lying, and so it's another thing, another step towards accountability being easier. So, and it has had an effect. Some of the things that used to be more acceptable are now less acceptable because of the ease with which things can be reviewed. So we do have to be more mindful of not just not just avoiding personally insulting people or whatever, but actually trying to be just less less rude, I guess I should say. Um, Generally, unless there's a need for it. We're never going to eliminate the need for a law enforcement officer to come into a situation that is quickly deteriorating and establishing order by giving commands, firm, forceful commands. You know, if we take away the officer's ability to do that, then it completely hamstrings our ability um, to keep the peace. You know, because there's times when that is what is needed. You come in and you just you know um, interrupt the process. But there's a lot of times when we're just interacting with people, and if we're just having a bad day, or we're having a hard time or whatever, that you know that we might be rude at times when we don't need to be and stuff. So that is, I think, probably the biggest transformative thing that's happened in law enforcement with body cameras, is just the knowledge that it's all recorded and it's all going to court, has that effect on what we say and what we do, because we don't want to get in trouble, because we do want, we don't want that played back in court, us being uh, rude to somebody that, unnecessarily. So that's kind of all of my rambling rant on that topic, really, um, for now. So see you on the next one.